Welcome, everyone. I'm talking to Ben Hine today. Ben is the author of Parental Alienation, a contemporary guide for parents, practitioners, and policymakers. I first came across Ben at um, the British Psychological Society's men's sections conference, where he delivered a really moving paper that was an ethnographic study into his own experience of being the child, a victim of parental alienation. So that really struck a chord with me, and I've been wanting to talk to you, Ben, since then. But I got your book, and I've recommended it to a few of my clients,
Oh, good.
and it
Thank
actually
you.
really resonated with me, and
Mm,
it moved me. What it was, well, we'll get into it later, but just to see it in very simple terms, many of the
mm,
elements that I've personally experienced as a parent,
mm,
without any partisan
mm.
stuff or negative energy. It was just very clear. So for me, the book's really important. But would you mind just giving us an introduction to who you are and how you got to where you are and what your work is?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Professor of Applied Psychology at the University of West London. And I've had it's been a very interesting journey to get to this kind of area, because it didn't follow a traditional, maybe academic trajectory where you
Mm,
develop an interest maybe at master's level, and then you do your PhD on that, and then you build on that and build on that. My PhD was on something completely different, and actually the first 6 or 7 years of my kind of decade in academia was kind of related, but certainly not in this area, as it were. But yeah, I just through various kind of interests that developed when I started at the university, I met various people at conference. I met Liz Bates, who listeners would probably be familiar with her work on male survivors of domestic violence, and we did quite a bit of work together on that. And within those studies, the theme of children kept coming again and again
mm,
and again, and it seemed to be a really big part of what shaped men's experiences. And so we then started to explore that type of abuse in more detail. So how can children be used, particularly post separation, but even within intact relationships? How can children be used as a vehicle um, for abuse based on the men's testimonies? And
mm,
we ran a study in 2019 that was specifically aiming to look at this experience in men. And during the pandemic, when we were analyzing that data, and I was, sequestered alone up in my loft office in my previous house, looking through these testimonies of men who'd been specifically asked to talk about their experiences of whether their children had been kind of weaponized against them. I found myself, for the first time as a researcher, I'm a fairly empathic person, so I'd always sympathized and empathized with the people that I was speaking to and male victims in general. But it was the first time when I found myself unable to continue and to do the analysis for prolonged periods of time, because I was starting to see actually there were
mm,
things that the men were saying that I was like, that just feels too close to home, and went on this journey, including a research meeting that I had with Liz, where I started just crying my eyes out, um, which I profusely apologized for because I thought it was wildly unprofessional. And she said, actually, there's something really good here. There's something really interesting here that you having this reaction. And that led me to this area, and kind of ever since it's kind of consumed now my whole kind of academic portfolio. It's what I have realized that I kind of maybe want to focus on. And it was through that kind of personal revelation that I then started engaging in the work that you spoke about. So the autoethnographic work with that I actually did with my father in the end, to jointly explore our experiences at that time. And alongside the professional exploration is then going back on my own personal journey of re-envisioning, re-remembering,
mm,
repainting a picture in my life that had been warped and painted in a particular way as a result of the behaviors themselves, and changing lots of my relationships, improving my relationship with my dad and my stepmom, and so it's been a bit of a wild ride actually, since 2020 particularly. I mean, that year was a wild ride for everybody because the pandemic didn't help matters, but it's it's led me here, and now I'm really focused on it as an area, and also more broadly. So as a consequence of that, how do we now help people to separate better? How do we manage their family court experiences more broadly? And it's really kind of brought me to there. So yeah, that's how I ended up here.
Thank you. I'm really struck by what you said about getting to a point where it was difficult to continue with the work, and that resonates a lot with me. I've had this deep interest in this area since I went to family court in 2019.
Yes, yeah.
And I noticed that every so often I just feel I can't
the weight
look at it.
Yeah.
And I know that a lot of men who have been through the experience, I'm sure women as well, they really want to do something to help change it, but actually following through is a different matter.
Well, it's an extra layer of emotional labor on top of an emotional load that is monumental, and that's what I've been kind of looking into, is how people cope with that emotional load following separation. Because I always start any talk by saying, look, family breakdown is a traumatizing experience, even if it goes well, and as well as it can do. So then if you start layering on different things to that, so things like post-separation abuse and gender roles. So for example, it does tend to be worse for men in terms of how they feel that they have to cope with that and not reaching out. And then if you layer on a court process on top of that, and it just becomes too much of a kind of emotional load for people, which is why we have such an issue around fathers and suicide following breakdown.
Do you have a reliable figure for that? Because I've seen really shocking figures linking, for example, people with arrears with the CMS and suicide, but I'm not sure if it's true.
Well, we've just completed I just completed a large study on fathers last year, and the report is out this month, and I'm actually giving a talk on the 19th of October at the University of West London, which is free public lecture if anyone wants to come along.
In person?
In person, yeah. And that piece of work produced a few headline figures that I think underpins the severity of the issue. So, for example, we did a case review, not to spoil the talk too much, but we did a case review of 1,000 cases of clients that had reached out to a father's support charity that specifically is supporting fathers with family separation and breakdown. And 40% of the fathers that were engaged with that service had suicidal thoughts in the previous 12 months, and many of them were actively suicidal. And this organization has a I say wonderful, obviously deeply distressing, but wonderful graphic that shows a live pattern of the clients that are experiencing suicide ideation at any given time that are engaged with their service. And there are blue dots for those who aren't and red dots for those who are, and it's a sea of red dots across the UK of men specifically that we know are in that place at at any given time. So that's just one of many kind of stats that is in the report and is in previous literature. So previous studies have established that men are 11 times more likely to engage in suicide ideation following divorce than women. It's those types of stats that underpin the idea that we're pitching with this report, that we have a pretty serious hidden public health crisis in this country around separation, particularly with fathers, that we need to address.
Can you give a ballpark figure of how many men or how many people are in this situation? So how many families are separating?
So if we try and work the maths through, for example, so we know that in any given year, there's around 110,000 couples that separate. Of course, some of those, no, not yet. No. So of course, some of those couples will be same sex, but for the sake of argument, let's assume that 90% or 99% of those are going to be heterosexual couples separating. So about half of those have at least one child under 16. So then you're looking at, say, 55,000 couples that are experiencing family breakdown any given year.
Oh, that's a lot.
With a child that, yeah, it is a lot. It is a lot. So under 16. So if we then assume that each of those couples obviously has the two principal actors of a mother and a father, that would assume that there are, say, 55,000 fathers any given year that experience family breakdown with a child in their household that's under the age of 16. So if you then approximate the figure of 40% to that from the case review, and that's testing my maths, but 40% of 50,000 is around 20,000.
Yeah,
so what you're dealing with is, in any given year, potentially, with that very loose rough maths, we have 20,000 fathers who are
suicide risk.
Yeah.
And even very conservatively, if we just said half of them, that's 10,000 suicide risk.
Yeah.
And
so that gives an indication of the scale of the problem, that for various reasons, which could probably be a whole session on its own, is overlooked and not taken as seriously as it should be. And that's what this report and the launch event is looking to kickstart the narrative of, and the debate of, is to try and bring more public but also policymaker awareness of the scale of the issue. And the one thing I would note about those numbers is that they are conservative, because of course you can only conduct a case review on men that are still alive. So how many men have been suicidal and completed suicide because they didn't get access to a service, above those numbers? So that's 10, say we take the most conservative estimate of 10,000 men, that's 10,000 men any given year that we know of, based on statistics, based on men that are still alive. So how many men have completed suicide because of the family breakdown process, potential lack of contact for their children, potentially post-separation abuse, et cetera, et cetera. It's a serious problem.
What are each of those, each completion, suicide completion, is obviously a tragedy for the individual, but how does that then ripple out to, how does that affect the kids? If we just try and keep our conversation child-centric for a minute.
Course, yeah.
What happens to a child whose parent has killed themselves?
It would be hard, I think, as a professional in this area, and I think anybody, to understate the profundity of what losing a parent does. And as someone who has lost a parent, and did so at a relatively young age, I can speak to that on a personal level.
You were about 12.
Well, I lost my mum when I was 18, but it was from a long-term illness that was across my whole life. But to then add on to that, and to layer that with an event that is layered in additional trauma, because obviously the loss of parent is traumatic, but you can have more traumatic circumstances, for example, suicide, particularly if that relationship was previously positive. That can add an extra layer of trauma.
Just unpack that. Sorry to jump in, but
yeah,
just unpack what you just said there. So if the relationship was positive previously, but then the parent kills himself, what does that do?
So all of this is based on attachment theory, and the way that attachment theory shapes our experience of relationships and life, and our sense of security. So this is why, for example, I talk about parental alienation being such a damaging form of abuse, is because it is an attack on the attachment system. Because, and as you will well know in your line of work, and some people listening will know, when children, particularly between the ages of 0 and 3, will formulate a internal working model which is kind of a mental representation of how people in their environment respond to them, based on a blueprint given by their caregivers. And that will give them kind of a baseline blueprint of fundamentally how safe they are and can feel within the world, and it provides the blueprint for our relationships subsequently. So if you have a parent or multiple parents, or any caregiver, in fact, it doesn't have to be limited to parents, that provide and build up an impression of safety and security by, for example, sensitively responding when you have needs, etc., you will then develop what's called a secure attachment, where you will have an idea that the world is fundamentally a safe place that you can go about, your business in and feel secure in. The issues then arise when you have, for example, processes that lead to an insecure attachment in the first instance. So, for example, if that parent isn't sensitively responding, you can lead to different types of insecure attachment, again, as you know. So, insecure avoidant, insecure resistant, etc. Other issues arise when you have a previously secure attachment that then becomes insecure and damaged via an event or process. And that is so damaging to the child, because what you are doing is you are attacking their fundamental understanding of the world in terms of their safety. And I don't think you can do many more things that are more damaging than that. And, the equivalent, I say to people, it's almost like, when Neo was told about the Matrix, you think about how profound that recalibration was in his mind in terms of having to understand the world completely differently to the version of it that he had built up prior. As an adult, we have the capacity, and he had the capacity in the movie, and we would have the capacity as adults to process that information in a way that wouldn't be as damaging. When you do that to children, however, because they are still in the process of formulating that opinion, it's extremely psychologically distressing and disconcerting, because you are disrupting a process that is still ongoing and is extremely malleable, which is why it can be so successful. So linking back to your original question of, why is potentially suicide of a parent, suicide completion by a parent, so traumatic? It's because you are essentially delivering as blunt a trauma to that attachment system as you can deliver, because you are fundamentally removing, often in the click of a fingers and in the tick of a moment, that child's understanding of the safety that they have in the world, and you're removing that from them, because the person that they had identified and built up a cognitive map of as being the person to keep them safe, or one of the people, is now gone. So
they're gone because of a decision that they made. It's intentional.
And that will also invite, and this is again why you have different layers of trauma that can be allocated to those disruptions to attachment, is because that will invite different questions than, for example, if a parent is removed for something that the child can conceptualize as being beyond the parent's control. That's not saying that necessarily people that complete suicide are in control, because we know often that they are not, because of the psychological space they're in. But to the child's conceptualization, they still see that as more of a quote unquote voluntary act than, for example, if a parent was killed in a car crash. So again, that layers, and that adds an additional layer of trauma to that act on the attachment system. And if you think that you have the situation where, by the extension of our maths that we've been working through, an associated minimum 10,000 children, because of course the figure I gave to you was based on just at least one child of 16, under 16 in the household. It could be, however many. So you're looking at a minimum of 10,000 children per year
really
that are at risk, a bottom figure, are at risk of that type of disruption to their attachment system, which may well have already begun and been precipitated by alienating behaviours, because those do the same things. They attack the attachment system. They attack the child's conceptualization of the actor in their life as someone who will keep them safe. So we've got a public health emergency in relation to the men specifically, but we've also got, a child safety, a child public health issue as well, because we are then opening ourselves up to the risk of the ripple effect that you were kind of alluding to and describing, of then the associated public health issues that will present in those children. And that's before you get into any other socio-cognitive emotional detriments that children who have parents who complete suicide suffer from, for things like, you know, lower school achievement, higher truancy, difficulty forming peer relationships, you know, all of those other things as well, and increased risk of psychopathology. So it's a really, really serious issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm quite I'm more nervous about this talk, I think, than any other I've ever given. The lecture that I'm giving is very soon, because it's going to be a tough listen, I believe. One that needs to happen.
Thank you for you. I really appreciate your work, because it's it's so necessary, and we just need to get this information in front of the policymakers, which you're doing. I mean, this book is
trying, yeah.
It's so digestible. There's little bullet points, and each chapter is very. You don't have to read it in a linear way. You can just jump around.
I'm glad that that's how it's you know, being read in that way, because it was specifically designed. The reason I took it on was to sit between the two groups of texts that we have on the issue at the moment, which is the very, very heavy academic texts, which, for example, you know, that a member of the public wouldn't be able to pick up and read necessarily, and the other end of the spectrum, which is kind of really detailed personal stories and case studies that don't necessarily capture the breadth of experience and the academic rigor. So it was designed to sit in between those two, and to give people a kind of really digestible guide that could be picked up by public, practitioner, policymaker, psychologist, anyone, to say, look, here's the bottom line around the issues, and here are the bottom line around what we need to do around them. So I'm glad it's being read and received in that way. So that's great.
I'd love to jump into some of it, but just before that, I think it would be really helpful for listeners to get a sense of what your personal experience was as a child, and also what was it like pulling this book out of yourself.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think it's never a bad thing when you're researching something you're passionate about, because it helps drive you forward. It helps you know, push your interests without compromising objectivity, because we're all trained researchers, so that's never an issue. What I am finding is I do think there are moments where I feel like, in a way that I'm happy to do, because hopefully it's helping people, but I think there are little pieces of me that potentially some of these things have taken, but I think they are equaled by parts of myself that I have been able to potentially heal as a result of the work and the way the work has pushed me. You know, writing the book was one of those activities that I think took a piece from me, because it was a lot to wade through, and when you are almost doing it in a constant state of being triggered by the information that you're looking at,
I don't know how I don't know how you did it, honestly, because it covers everything.
I just hold myself away and took myself off and didn't speak to people. But yeah,
because it's not just one bit, it's the entire 360-degree view of parental alienation. And I was really blown away by that. I just thought, wow, you've sat with this and just pushed all the way through.
Yeah, tried. And you know, other activities that are in the similar vein is when you do work, especially work that involves that detailed qualitative data that you get from fathers, that takes from me. Absolutely, when you're reading experiences that, even not necessarily reflective of your own, although that came up a lot, but also when you're reading experiences that I think fundamentally are distressing. They are. I would challenge anybody not to be moved by what we have heard, especially in this report. But consequently, or rather conversely, there are other things that have allowed little pieces of me to come back. And through doing that autoethnographic work, I think I'm closer to my father than I've ever been, which is something that I'm immensely grateful for, to have the opportunity to have explored that with him, and heal some of those wounds. But yeah, it is challenging. In terms of my personal story, it's I always look back on it and think, yeah, crikey, this was a bit of a wild one. But I mean, essentially, it was a story of, I had my parents met. They were both coming out of long-term relationships. They met, fell in love very quickly, and were in love, got married, had me, and it was then kind of revealed through a doctor's appointment that a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis had been withheld from my biological mother, and that they hadn't been privy, neither of them had been privy to that information, before they met, before they got married. It was kind of gatekept by my maternal grandparents. And that triggered a kind of series of events over the first 4 years of my life, where the relationship, through the strain that placed on, through my mother's reaction to that information, which wasn't very positive, and the influence of the ongoing influence of those maternal grandparents, led to the deterioration of the relationship, which led to my parents separating when I was 4 years old. But that separation didn't come as the result of sitting down and talking through and saying, yes, we want this to happen. It came as the result of my abduction from the family home, where my dad left for work one day, was obviously in this place where he was aware that the relationship was deteriorating, but no conversation had been had, and came home, and my mother, myself, and all our furniture was gone, and nowhere to be kind of seen. I found a note was left saying, you're not good enough, you don't deserve to be in anybody's life, so just let us know when you can send the child support payments, and that will be your role from now on. And I think potentially that's a point in my story where a few listeners, particularly fathers, will go, yes, okay, that sounds like a familiar story in terms of the financial side. And that basically initiated a 4-year period, 2 outside of court, 2 in, when I was 4 to 8, very formative years, as anyone who even isn't a developmental psychologist will know, where there was a kind of, and I've always characterized it as a battle, because that's how it felt, and that's how the parties kind of entered it, the custody battle for where I should live. And then within that time, there was parental alienation on the part of largely my maternal grandparents, as a proxy for my mum, who was becoming more ill, against my father. So, engaging in various strategies, bad mouthing, guilt tripping, etc., to damage the relationship that I had with him. Even though I saw him every other weekend, it was designed to erode that relationship and place wedges and barriers. And some were very overt, some were less so. So, for example, my dad is a football fanatic, and I was specifically steered away and banned from speaking about football or anything to do with football when I was with my grandparents, as a way of kind of decreasing that interest from me to distract, and some of those behaviors can be very, very subtle, but they're very powerful, because it's something to this day that we still maybe have a little issue around, and I certainly still have a hang up around, is that I'm not sporty enough and I don't like sports enough. And then the court case concluded when my grandparents actually withdrew the case because of a cancer diagnosis for my maternal grandmother, which interestingly she had received much earlier on, but decided not to disclose to keep the case going, so that it would cost my dad more money and a more emotional turmoil. But then turned around 2 days before the conclusion and said, do you know what, you can have him, we're out. So that involved a transfer of residency. And, across this time, talking about, you can guess what my dad's experiences were. They're the experiences that we see in the report that's coming out, the battling, the financial drain, the emotional drain. As a child in that situation, I think, guilt and confusion, I think, are the two principal emotions that I relate back to that time, of the memories that I have, some of which, I don't know, potentially are repressed because of the distressing nature of it. But yeah, just, because it was a 4-year loyalty conflict, and anybody who's ever been involved in any kind of loyalty conflict knows that it's a horrible place to be. And when you then place that on a child, it's hugely damaging. So
what was going through your head? Tell us about the guilt.
Because you always feel, when you're placed in the middle of a loyalty conflict, you feel like you're constantly in betrayal of both parties. So it's a very big emotional burden to carry, because you feel that you're constantly in this kind of seat of betrayal, because every time you go and see your father, you're told, that was a particular phrase, or your mother's ill, she needs you, you need to be here and support her. And then it was less so on my father's side, but you still fundamentally feel guilty when you're, and it saps a lot of the joy out of life, because you feel that you can't enjoy things, because in the back of your mind you think that you're betraying the other party by having a good time. It's just horrid. It's just a really horrid thing that we kind of sadly quite routinely do to children during separation. And it's really, I feel like I should have more articulate language, but I think when you asked me about that time, I'm almost fighting 8-year-old Ben's perspective to come out and just describe it as, it was just horrible.
It's just horrible. And then what did you take from it as you got older? How did it impact you?
Oh gosh, I mean, a lot. I mean, the damage, a lot of the subsequent damage was then when the case had concluded, because there was such acrimony, residual acrimony from the process, that we were then left in a situation where there was almost reverse alienation, because my dad and my stepmom turned around, and I've discussed this with them at length. And they said, and I understand why now, and we've talked about it a lot. They said, look, we don't want anything to do with them. And I understand why that was the case, because of the trauma they had suffered. But for the child in that situation, I had a terminally ill mum. And I had to deal with that then subsequently largely on my own whenever I was in the family home, because there wasn't really a space to discuss or talk about that. So that's actually where a lot more of the damage was done, was dealing with that on my own. And then the subsequent, I guess, tipping point psychologically was when I was 18 and my mum passed away, because I had to go through that process largely alone, because all the parties were traumatized and couldn't deal with it, and largely left me to deal with that and be with my mum when she passed, which was extremely difficult, and I think fundamentally shaped and potentially warped a lot of my worldview, because I've always viewed myself as a fundamentally lonely and alone person. And I still feel that way now. I've had to do a lot of work on it, and I'm getting there, but I still fundamentally feel like I'm in a silo, and that it's hard to rely on people, and I'm always very cautious. And I don't know, it's interesting how you unpick, and when you go through different therapeutic journeys and try and unpick and link back, I mean, almost everything that I have brought up or discussed in my own journeys has been related back to that time and its subsequent impact. Self-esteem issues, reliance on academia for external validation, hence my drive and success in academia. Any of the issues or problems that I've potentially had in relationships have been related back to that time. My familial relationship issues with my father, and that's related to that time. And it just shapes fundamentally who you are, sometimes for the better. And I've worked a lot on trying to conceptualize the strength that can be drawn from survival of events like that. But fundamentally, it does shape you, sometimes in what I've certainly always viewed as negative ways. And the profundity is hard to underestimate, I think, in terms of what we are, semi-routinely doing to children in separation.
Thank you for sharing that. And it fits beautifully onto your description of the attack on the attachment system. So you've been living that yourself. The world was made less safe.
And the most interesting manifestation of that was actually when I became a parent myself. Because I love my children, as any parent, most parents, any parent does, I feel. I love them in a way that's indescribable, but actually their births were quite triggering events, because you are presented with not only a practical task of parenting that is hugely demanding and requires at least some sort of blueprint for how you were parented, but also you are being presented with, you know, a process where they're trying to attach with you that potentially raises questions about how you did that with your parents. So the main thing for me was I've always, you know, because I've always struggled with this idea of unconditional love and whether I am unconditionally loved because of everything I went through. When I experienced the giving of unconditional love for the first time, that ended up being very triggering, because I was like, why have I never had this feeling? Because I know if you said to me, unless you walk out in front of that train or bus, your child would die. I mean, I'm there. You do it in an instant, and that's the level that you're at. I have struggled for a number of years because I don't feel that I live in a world where I have people that would do that for me, as a result of the experiences that I went through. And I've spoken to my father about this, and you know, we've spoken about it a lot, and he says I am that person. I do feel that way. It's hard though. It's hard to heal the wounds when they run so psychologically deep. And I think that's, again, this is why I get so frustrated when people say either parental alienation isn't real, or it's pseudoscience and it's just a defense tactic, or that if it does exist, it's not that bad, or that it's not that common. I mean, none of those statements are true, and it's very frustrating.
That's a really good segue into the meat of it. So should we? I just made some notes when I was reading it. Just let's start with a definition. What is it?
So parental alienation, and what we've started to do in the area is distinguish between parental alienation as an outcome and parental alienating behaviours as a process. So parental alienation is an outcome where a child unjustifiably rejects a parent based on the actions of the other parent. So it's fundamentally where parent, let's call them parent A, will attack the relationship between the child and parent B, with the purpose of, you know, prompting that child to reject the parent. Now, the reason we delineate between the outcome and the behavior is because the behaviors are worthy of investigation in their own right, just as, for example, any form of abuse is worthy, because it doesn't necessarily always result in the outcome. It very much depends on the context, the situation, the child, what the behaviors are. So then parental alienating behaviors, or PABs, as they've become increasingly named, are the behaviors that parents engage in to attack the relationship between the child and the other parent. And we, you know, there's a lot of discourse in the area about whether there's a clear consensus on the definition, and I believe that to be a bad faith discussion, because the definition of domestic violence more broadly and the definition of any set of behaviors will change and mold over time. What we do know is the fundamentals are there. So people who say, oh, we can't progress with this because we don't have a consensus around definition, to those people I would say, we do. Read my book. There's a definition in there that has reached consensus. And two, by prompting this to be the debate, all you're doing is taking away from the fact that we need to address the issue, which does exist, because speak to anybody and they'll know at least someone who's experienced some form of this. So yeah,
it is incredibly common. I can't tell you how many men, not even men that I know, but just, you know, the man came over to fix the gas, or a neighbor's ex-partner, or I just meet them all the time. I'm not looking for it.
Any time I introduce or talk about what I do, whether that be to other parents at school, whether that to be to neighbors, whether that to be to students, you always get knowing nods from someone or other saying, oh yeah, I went through that, or I know someone who went through that. So yeah, I don't I can't get on board with the argument. It's not common. And we've actually just completed the first study in the UK on the prevalence of parental alienating behaviors, and you can have this as an exclusive, but it's around between 35 and 40% of people experiencing separation will have experienced some form of PAB following separation. So that throws the scarcity argument out the window, and we're just about to publish that.
Brilliant. That's so good to get some some meat around
Yeah,
this.
absolutely.
So I don't really want to spend a long time going down the rabbit hole, but why
Mm.
might there be a powerful lobby group saying that this is just all a mirage and it's not real?
Um, Personally, as a researcher, I don't know because I can't place a rational argument onto it.
Mhm.
Because from everything I have read, the reviews that I have read and also written, and any kind of systematic investigation of this area will produce the same conclusion, which is that parental alienation and its associated research has reached a level of consensus and synthesis. Um, so as a researcher and as an academic, I don't know. I can't comment because that to me as a researcher and someone who is committed to empiricism and objective evaluation of the literature, I don't understand how anyone can come to any different kind of conclusion. And I don't know whether it's right for me in my capacity and in this type of forum to conject onto why I think it might
Sure.
be.
Yeah.
But what I will say is the following. I am well aware, above and beyond anyone else, as someone who's researched this the most extensively, possibly out of any other person in the UK. And as is articulated in my book, I've never been shy or quiet or claim to be ignorant of the potential problematic origins of this area of research around Richard Gardner's work and potentially sometimes the willful misinterpretation of it.
He was an
However,
American
he
psychiatrist.
was an American psychiatrist, and he principally came up with a framework around parental alienation, specifically as a challenge to reports of sexual abuse amongst children. And again, I mean, I really try to steer people away from an extensive debate about Gardner, because my point whenever I talk about Gardner is that upwards of 40% of the research on parental alienation has been conducted in the last 7 years. And we have moved very, very strongly, very firmly to a position where we now have, excluding work that was conducted before 2010, a robust consensus of literature around what parental alienation is that has been explored in an empirical, methodologically robust manner that allows us to appreciate the historical context of an area without allowing that historical context to taint every single progression that we make. And the analogy I produce is we do not discount all of psychology because Freud potentially had some problematic ideas. We look back on Freud, I still teach Freud and his psychoanalytic approaches. And of course, elements of those approaches are still used today, and rightfully so. However, there were problems with Freud, just as there were problems with many originators of research strands or areas that we can grow. That's what we do as academics, particularly psychologists, is we evaluate, challenge, and improve. So, like you said, we could spend hours, especially over a drink in a pub somewhere, talking about why there seem to be a number of potentially bad faith actors talking about parental alienation in a certain way. And there are also legitimate issues in terms of how it maybe potentially is utilized. So I've never said that that's not the case.
Mm.
However, my response and my resolution proposed to that is fundamentally different because I don't wish to abandon the science. So I agree, for example, that there are potentially issues with how parental alienation is both raised and dealt with within family court. I've never said otherwise. However, my solution to that is to not say that parental alienation is pseudoscience, so let's just ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. Because that, to me, is a gross betrayal of children above all.
Mm.
What my solution is that the more we can learn about it, the more study and research that we do on it, and the more that we can use that to educate and shape policy in a fair and just way, surely that should be the approach.
Mm.
So a lot of the individuals that you're perhaps referencing, and that we hear from and that we see, and for example, there was a BBC News report just a few weeks ago.
The Panorama one? Was it Panorama?
No, it was Ed Thomas's
Oh
piece
yeah.
on mothers on the run and use of PA in family courts and DV claims. Now, there is potentially quite a big overlap with how much of that report I agree with and agree that there is potentially an issue. However, the response to that being labeling PA as so-called parental alienation throughout a report and labeling it as pseudoscience is just grossly unhelpful and a willful breach of kind of scientific communication principles. And because you're misleading and misguiding the public on that. It was similarly the case with a recent report by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office, the vast majority of which I agree with in principle. However, there are sections of that report that use the same phraseology, so-called parental alienation, and present parental alienation exclusively as a strategy purely employed by fathers to deny and undermine DV claims by mothers, when we know that domestic violence and parental alienation are not only both valid concepts, but can be experienced by both mothers and fathers. So again, there is an issue there, same it was in the UN report that was produced, that I don't understand how it's happening, because I contribute to all these processes with the evidence and the empirical evidence behind it. But we fight on, we soldier on.
Thanks. That's a really useful overview. Okay, so we've got about 12 minutes. Yeah, let's just try and get a bit of the material. So you've spoken about the losses of the child. How does parental alienation impact parents?
Yeah, I mean, for fathers, we're starting to unpick and see this distinct link between loss of contact, either through accident or design or malicious intent, that is linked to these profound mental health issues. But that is similarly the case for mothers. It just tends to be more exaggerated in men because of the influence of male gender roles and help seeking, etc. But
men are less likely to seek help, and be vulnerable.
And also to have those support systems in place, even informally, to help them. Although reassuringly, many of the men who contributed to our study did speak about informal support networks, which was good to hear. But there's a variety of impacts that it has on work, financial situation, other broader health, not just mental health, but health, things like sleeping, overeating, etc. And also relationships, so inability to form relationships, particularly new romantic relationships, because of the level of betrayal by the existing or previous romantic partner. So yeah, targeted parents are hugely affected. And in the book, I tried to make sure to also explore and appreciate and empathize with the experience of alienating parents. And that was very challenging to write, and it's challenging to read, especially for alienated parents. But fundamentally, a lot of the perceived malicious intent actually comes from trauma on behalf of the alienating parent themselves. And whether that is reactivated attachment trauma from their own childhood, whether that is an issue in terms of personality disorder, kind of cluster B type personality disorder, or whether that is from a place of fear, hurt, betrayal based on the spousal breakdown, I make it very clear that we have to allow space in the debate, similarly to my thoughts on how we allow space to talk about perpetrators more broadly in the DV space, to understand behavior without excusing behavior. And I think you can do those things.
Yeah, I was really impressed with the way you did that. You talked about the difference between understanding and pathologizing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And that's really critical. And also, the difference between understanding and excusing, and there's never any benefit to exploring what is a really critical side of a coin. You can't look at alienated parents without looking at alienating parents. They obviously present their own challenges, because often they won't volunteer for studies because they don't think they're doing anything wrong. And sometimes they don't even realize that they're alienating the other parent. So there are challenges there, but I think we have to have our pathway for investigation moving forward has to be as holistic as possible. And this is why, the impact chapter, or the impact section rather, looks at yes, in the most obvious sense, the alienated parents and the child, but it also looks at the alienating parents and other family members, extended family, siblings, grandparents. You know, siblings I found very fascinating in terms of doing the research on that and meeting some siblings at a conference, because I'd always assumed it was an all or nothing situation. If you alienate one child, you alienate them all. But actually, it's very common that parents do it to one and not the other, and they pick favorites to do it too. So that was really fascinating. So the impact stuff, I think, even though there are groups that need more explanation, as I try and portray in the book in terms of building this evidence base, I think in terms of section 1, which is what it is, and section 2, which is the impact, I think we are at a critical mass with those two areas in terms of we can fairly confidently say what parental alienation is and how it's enacted, and also how it's measured, as well as we can confidently say what the impact is in enough of a way to say this is a serious issue. I think what we're then focusing on moving forward, or we should be focusing on, is section 3, which is application. So how does it then manifest within legal systems, and how are we ill-equipped, and how are we not doing a good enough job with early intervention and in breakdown? And that's where we are now moving to and focusing on. And I'm involved in a few really exciting projects in those areas, you know, developing an app for separating parents, looking at case review of family court cases. So trying to tackle all of those different things to say PA is real, it's not going anywhere, it's highly prevalent, it has a huge impact, so let's do something about it, rather than pretending it doesn't exist, which is not going to help anyone, least of all children.
What is the state of education and training for legal and mental health professionals in this space?
Poor, extremely poor. You know, we're just starting, I think, to get there, or at least breach this idea that legal professionals are going to require this training. But we have so many other actors within the sphere that can unwittingly aid alienation because there is not enough training. So I do a lot of volunteering for my local school, and there is a document which is the Keeping Kids Safe in Schools document, which is a government piece of guidance that's distributed to all staff, all volunteers, anyone involved in safeguarding. That document, in my opinion, does not sufficiently cover what happens to children during family breakdown and, for example, separation associated abuse such as parental alienation. And actually that could be really useful, because teachers could be not only actors to help identify parental alienation and refer people on to specific authorities, but they could also be unintentionally contributing by, for example, only giving information out to one parent when there is no court order that suggests that should be the case.
I remember you mentioned that yourself.
Yeah.
You told the school specifically to contact you because your wife is further away working, and they just kept contacting her.
Yeah, I finally managed to solve it, but that's only because I'm so embedded with the school as a volunteer and governor now that I think they've started to listen. But it took a long time to explain and basically outline my value as a parent, to say I am perfectly capable of taking this call and should be taking this call, because if you call my wife, she's 90 minutes away, whereas I am at home. So if you need someone to come and, you know, we had an incident where my son was hit in the face at school and he had a cut, and that we needed to come and assess, you know. Now, on that particular day, my wife was at home and I was at work, so it worked out then. But any other day, I need to be the person, because I'm often closer, to go and sort that out. So it's just those little things where you have it embedded, often by accident, not by design, in policy, to not account for these nuances of separated family systems and units, and the potential that opens up for abuse within those scenarios. And that could be really improved, similarly with CAFCAS and social workers, and similarly with the legal profession. So that's what we need to work on, as well as public awareness, of course.
Yeah, so you outline some of the societal stereotypes that may exacerbate parental alienation. Can you just go through a couple of them?
Yeah, I think principally there are probably two. The first one is around separation and divorce itself, because I think particularly in this country, we seem to be okay and have a stereotype that separation and divorce is acrimonious just as a standard, and it is really vicious, and you're always going to have parents fighting. And I think what that does is it opens the window, opens the door to inappropriate behavior, but that society excuses. I think a lot of people wouldn't actually think too much of one parent bad mouthing the other parent in front of a child, and that is not an acceptable place for us to be in as a society, because we shouldn't really ever be doing that. No matter what you have had issues wise on a spousal level, if the parental role is safe and can be fulfilled, then we should allow that to happen. So I think that's one of the main ones around separation and divorce generally. There are, of course, gender stereotypes that come into play depending on who the alienated parent is. So, for example, when the alienated parent is a father, people don't seem to really mind that much because of the stereotypes that we have around fatherhood and the value, or rather lesser value, that fathers have supposedly in children's lives, which is not supported by any of the evidence whatsoever in terms of child outcomes. That can have a huge impact on whether fathers get support, be it informally or formally, and the judgments they get, and etc. And basically the value we place on them having contact with their children. So there's a lot that we need to challenge directly and in an immediate way and in a tangible way, but also in an abstract level and at the macro level where we look at societal attitudes. And this is why, as an extension of this work, I am also starting to get much more interested in separation psychology more broadly. How can we help couples to separate and navigate family breakdown better more broadly? Because inherently, if you do that better, you will close off many of the avenues for PA.
Yeah, so you're endorsing parenting coordinators and psychoeducation for separating parents.
There's no reason why we shouldn't have some kind of community embedded apparatus to help people with family breakdown. It's not as if it's an uncommon event, and it's also not as if we don't have those infrastructures in place, especially recently with the introduction of family hubs. There is no reason why family hubs shouldn't have separation under their remit. So we need to have, and this is recommended in the report, which will be available in a few weeks' time and launched at the talk, is we need to have, for example, family breakdown triage. Because what is happening so often is that actually people could be caught at the right moment and helped to get these co-parenting arrangements in place, deal with the issues that they have had in order to be successful separated parents. There's nothing like that in the place. And, we have situations, for example, in Scandinavian countries where those models exist. And guess what? Everyone's outcomes are better and hardly anyone uses family courts.
Yeah, seems very clear.
All the evidence is there. We just need to have the political will to act on it.
Yeah. It's not rocket science, is it?
I don't think so. Some people like to make out that it's rocket science and that it's overly complicated. I don't think it's overly complicated to say, providing both parents are safe and good enough parents, they should be a part of children's lives for the benefit of the child themselves and the parent. That seems to have become a controversial topic, and that to me is a very worrying sign.
Ben, thank you so much.
Thank you, Zach.
We'll come up on the hour now, so I'm going to let you go. Really enjoyed our chat. Maybe we could do another one in future. There's so much more to unpack, but I love how cogent and clear you are, and I recommend everyone to have a look at this book if you're in this space or you're a parent going through separation. It's you've done a great job at being neutral and very well referenced and easy to digest information.
Thank you. So that was the aim. So I'm really glad to hear that. And thank you for having me on for this chat. And I'm, like you said, there's so many different rabbit holes and avenues to go down. So always happy to come on and follow up on different aspects of it. But thank you. And thank you everyone who's listened to this. And if anyone wants to reach out directly,
where can they find you?
So my Twitter handle is just at Hine. My DMs are open, as it were. And
that's
my
Hine.
Hine. And my email is just ben.hine, Hine, at uwl.ac.uk. And if anyone wants to get in contact for whatever reason, really, I'm always here.
And very quickly, that talk you're giving soon, where can
Yeah,
people find it?
so I can what I'll do is I'll share the Eventbrite link with you, Zach, so you can maybe put it
Great.
with this talk. But yeah, if you go onto Eventbrite, you should be able to find it. But it's on the 19th of October at
Okay.
6 p.m. at the University of West London on the Ealing campus. And that will be it's on the Lost Dads report, exploring the relationship between fathers, family breakdown, abuse, and suicide.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks,
Go
Zach.
well. See you
Yeah, you
soon.
too. Thanks,
Cheers.
Zach.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.